Okay, we're going live. So hi everybody. So this is the last panel of the night. This is me in conversation with Doug Johnstone.
Yeah.
So I hope you all enjoy this. I'm just going to reposition this because this is not me. So let's introduce Doug. Doug Johnstone is a writer, musician, and journalist based in Edinburgh. His 10th novel, Breakers, was published by Organiser Books in May 2019 and was shortlisted for the McIlvanney Prize for Scottish Crime Novel of the Year. His previous books include The Jump, shortlisted for the McIlvanney Prize, Gone Again, an Amazon bestseller, and Hit and Run, which was an Amazon #1, as well as being selected as a prestigious fiction undercovered winner. His work has received praise from the likes of Irvine Welsh, Ian Rankin, Val McDermid, William McIlvanney, Megan Abbott, and Christopher Brookmyre. Doug has been writer-in-residence with William Purvis Funeral Directors. He is also a Royal Literary Fund Consultant Fellow and was RLF Fellow at Queen Margaret University in Edinburgh, 2014 to 2016. Doug was also writer-in-residence at the University of Strathclyde from 2010 to 2012, and before that worked as a lecturer in creative writing there. He's had short stories appear in various publications and anthologies, and since 1999 he has worked as a freelance artist journalist, primarily covering music and literature. He is also manuscript assessor for the Literary Consultancy and Emergence in the Scottish Highlands. He has taught creative writing at...
Yeah, I was just saying yes, Emergence. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, no, that it's me trying to read off my thing. Technology, I love it. He has taught creative writing at festivals and conferences and regularly at the Monarch Moor, and has mentored aspiring writers for the New Writing North and Scottish Book Trust. Doug is one of the co-founders of the Scotland Writers Football Club. Is that something to do with the bloody Scotland versus England thing?
No, it's kind of separate actually. So the Scotland Writers thing is a full 11-a-side football team that we play occasional friendlies against local charities and stuff, and also occasional internationals against other writers football teams. The thing at bloody Scotland is a more informal 5-a-side sort of kickabout. It's Craig Robertson that kind of sorts that one out. So I just come along if I can and sclaff about.
Right. Okay. When I read it, I was like, oh, I wasn't sure if that was something to do with that. And then he also puts in a shift in midfield as a player manager. He's also singer, musician, and songwriter in several bands, including Northern Alliance, who have released 4 albums to critical acclaim, as well as recording an album as a fictional band called the Oceans, which was that something to do tied in with the book that you wrote, or was that?
Yeah, it was. So I was in a band at the time. It's a long story, but there's lots of lyrics for this fictional band in that book. It's about a fictional band. And the lyrics were quite good, so I ended up writing songs, and then the songs were quite good, so me and my actual band recorded them and pretended to be the Ossians. And then I could take my guitar to book events and do cover versions of Ossian songs, which were really my songs.
Oh, wow. I was like, yeah, I remember reading that book, because at that time that I also love music, so I was like, oh, I'd always thought like I knew about the fun writing criminals, and I was like, oh, I wonder about that one. That's, you've got such an interesting thing. You're like crime writer and writer and all this, and I'm like,
That does make me sound very busy, but I'm not as busy as all that, honest.
And also he plays the drums for the Fun-Loving Crime Writers, a crime writing supergroup featuring Val McDermid, Mark Billingham, Chris Brookmyre, Stuart Neville, and Luca Vesti.
Yeah,
I think that's still the lineup, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
And you also have a degree in physics, a PhD in nuclear physics, and a diploma in journalism, and has worked for 4 years designing radar.
Yes.
So very interesting, very interesting. Yeah, I think I knew about the physics thing because I think when I first either met you, or it was either Bloody Scotland, or it was one at the Edinburgh Book Festival, or when I had you on There's Been Murder for the email questions Q&A. Yeah. I'm sure that came into it, but when you look into all the stuff you've done, you think, how did you ever get time to be a crime writer? But then I suppose things develop, and you know, you get a wee niche, and you're just like run with it. But I think you're going to do a reading. Is that right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
You're right. Yeah. So I'm just going to read a little bit from, where are we? My latest novel. This is The Big Chill, which is my 12th novel. It comes out. It's actually out in ebook already, but it comes out in paperback next Thursday, the 20th. And I'm going to be doing a joint launch event with Val McDermott because we both got books out on the same day. And we're doing that in the Portobello bookshop, and they're gonna, which is my local. I live in Portobello in Edinburgh, and it's my local bookshop, and they're going to stream it live. So I'm going to read. This is the second in a trilogy. The first book of the trilogy was called The Dark Matter, which was just longlisted for the McIlvanney Prize this year. And so this second book, it's about, just if no one knows about these books, they are about 3 generations of women from the same family who have to run a funeral directors and a private investigators when the patriarch of the family dies. So there's Dorothy, who's 70 years old, Jenny, who's 45, and Hannah, who's 20. So the books are full of death, obviously, and a lot of dark humor. So there's crimes to be solved, mysteries to be solved, and dead people to bury or cremate. So I'm just going to read a short passage from the start of this second book. It's hard to really talk too much about this book because of spoilers from the first book. Because I mean, it is a standalone. You can read it on its own, but there's a lot of. It's set 6 months after the first book in the series, and so they're still kind of reeling from the aftermath of what happened there. But this, so this little extract is from the point of view of Dorothy, and it starts at the opening scene. Is her and Archie, who works for the funeral directors, and they're conducting a funeral in Edinburgh Eastern Cemetery, which is just next to Easter Road. She stood with her hands clasped at the funeral party gathered around the grave. She looked at some nearby gravestones, recent additions, engravings still sharp, lots of flowers and photographs. The Skelfs had buried some of these people, and she wondered how the bereaved were coping. Were they dealing with it better than she was with Jim's death? It was half a year now, and it was true what she'd told others for decades. The sharp pain did reduce, replaced by an aching throb. Background emotional noise that gave life a bittersweet edge. The young Church of Scotland minister said a few quiet words to Robert Gordon Blackie and his sons. They were working class Scottish men, buttoned up and stoic. There would be no wailing and gnashing of teeth today. Plus, Susan Blackie had suffered dementia for years, so it felt like she'd left them a long time ago. Death was often a relief, though it was hard to admit that. The minister began the familiar intonations of the ceremony. Susan's life was remembered. Her fragile nature in the face of the Almighty was given a nod. The minister was in his 20s, floppy black fringe that he kept touching. Dorothy wondered how someone went into that profession fresh from school or college. But then she had entered the funeral business at the same age. She looked around. The oak and beech trees were coming into leaf, the rejuvenation of spring. But there would be no rejuvenation for Susan Blackie. Nevertheless, Dorothy couldn't help feeling something, a sense of rebirth, a chance to make the world new again. The highest branches swayed in the breeze, pigeons and crows perched and watching. Dorothy heard the shush of Easter Road traffic mixed with the minister's words. His voice didn't have the gravitas for funerals yet, not enough experience. The Blackie men stared stony-faced at Susan's coffin, as if they could lower it into the ground with sheer willpower. Dorothy heard a police siren, faint but getting louder. She listened for the change in pitch, the Doppler effect Hannah had explained to her when the source of the sound travelled away instead of towards you. But it didn't change. The wailing just got louder, making the minister pause his eulogy. There was an almighty metallic crash, and Dorothy spun round to see the iron cemetery gates buckle and spring from their hinges, clatter into the stone pillars either side, and collapse as an old white Nissan careened into the graveyard and pummeled along the gravel path on the south side, rising into the air over bumps and swerving between graves. It was moving at maybe 50 miles per hour, engine a high whine as the siren got louder and a police car thundered through the cemetery gates in pursuit. The Nissan braked and swerved at the bend in the path, fishtailed into a headstone which fell like a domino. The car straightened and sped up, the police car copying its trajectory round the bend, running onto the grass. The Nissan glanced off 2 more gravestones and ricocheted across the path, the gravestones tearing chunks from the front bumper, denting the driver's door. It was 100 yards away from the hearse, the family car, and Susan's coffin. The Blackie party stood with eyes wide, Dorothy the same, the minister with his mouth open. The hearse was blocking the path, but the Nissan kept racing towards them, bouncing along, clattering against headstones and thumping over grassy mounds. The police car was behind, lights flashing, sirens screaming. The Nissan was almost at the hearse now as Dorothy felt someone pulling her. Archie was yanking her arm. She stumbled towards a large memorial stone just as the Nissan rushed past her, swerved away from the rear of the hearse, scattering mourners, the Blackie men jumping out of the way. The car clattered into the gravestone next to Susan's coffin, bounced into the air, then its front end dipped and it landed with a sickening thud halfway in the empty grave, its rear end hanging in the air, wheels spinning. The police car skidded to a halt a foot from the hearse and its siren stopped. The sudden quiet was disorienting as Dorothy straightened and ran to the Nissan. She went past Susan's coffin, which seemed unscathed, to the driver's side of the car. She hauled at the crumpled door 3, 4 times. Eventually it opened and she leaned in. Behind the wheel was a dishevelled young man in dirty clothes with longish hair and an untidy beard. He wasn't wearing a seatbelt and there was no airbag. He had a long gash across his forehead, which was leaning against a crack in the windscreen. Blood poured from his ear. He was dead. Dorothy knew that look better than anyone. She held the door open, staring at him as the young police officer arrived behind her. He looked at the Nissan's driver, eyes wide. He'd obviously not seen as many dead bodies as Dorothy. His face went pale. Dorothy heard a noise from the back seat. She leaned in, heard the noise again, a whimper. She spotted him, a small border collie with one eye. The dog climbed forward from the back and licked the driver's head wound, tasting its owner's blood. It whined and shrank away. Dorothy turned to the young cop, who was shaking. "What the hell?" she said. Here you go.
So the first question off of that one would be, so obviously before you did the Sky books, you were more known for doing standalones. What made you decide to change from just doing... I think one of your standalones did have characters that popped up in a later book. I think it was Hit and Run, and then did they not appear in... One of the characters not appear in another one later on?
Yeah, it did. Yeah, but that's the only connection. Yeah, so some of the characters who were like some of the secondary characters in Hit and Run ended up being main characters or more major characters in the Deadbeat, which followed a few books along. But in general, I've just done standalone books. So the first 10 were all, separate, completely separate books. The truth was that with these Skelf books, it was a deliberate, conscious attempt to stretch myself as a writer, actually. I just wanted to do something different because the standalone books tended to be from a single point of view, and they're very short, and they were deliberately sort of fast-paced and claustrophobic. And that was a very deliberate strategy on my part. But I just had felt, I don't know if it was just maybe because it was 10 books and that was enough for just now. But I just wanted to do something different. So I had this idea. I had an idea for a long time about, well, it's various things about where the ideas for books come from. But usually it's a million ideas that coalesce all into one thing. But I had an idea for a returning character, which the first person I had actually in mind was Jenny Skelf, the sort of middle-aged one out of the 3 Skelf women. And I had this idea of her being a private investigator who doesn't know how to private investigate. I liked that idea of her being thrown into it. Either she's inherited the business or something like that. And I was kicking around that idea for like a decade before I wrote it. It's like for a long time. And gradually, as I sort of worked it up, I kind of wanted to do more complicated things structurally as well. So different points of view, a lot more complicated plotting with a lot more different mystery timelines and things like that. I hadn't really solved mysteries much before in the books either. So all of that kind of coalesced into this idea that I would have these 3 Skelf women. And as I was sort of working on the first book, planning it before I started writing it, even it became very clear to me that that I'd want to spend more time with them. That there was the opportunity to come back and revisit them. So I had an idea how the first book would end, and then I immediately had an idea how to start the second one and how it would be the aftermath of what had happened in the first book. And so there is, I mean, it's Orenda, my publisher, sometimes are punting it as a trilogy, sometimes as a series. There's definitely a trilogy planned. I've written a first draft of the third one, and then I'm going to take a break and do other stuff. But I probably will return to them because I'm having so much fun writing these books at the moment. Actually, I'm enjoying spending time with these characters, and the challenge of the structure of it and the different voices. I've really enjoyed that as well. I've really, much more than I thought I would. Actually, I was kind of slightly worried about it before I started because it was new ground for me. But actually, I've really enjoyed it. I've really enjoyed writing these books, which is not something that many writers say very often. So I'm quite happy with that.
So, what books do you find easier to write? Standalones or a trilogy, a series? Because some authors do say they find, as you just said, series or trilogy because they can continue the characters on and they know how they're building. Others say standalones because that's it done. You don't have to think about the characters. You just kind of get them plotted, and you don't have to see them again unless you find the character that you like, everybody really likes, and everybody hounds you to kind of like continue the story.
Well, there's kind of pros and cons to both, Lynsey. Honestly, it's like I wouldn't say that I preferred one definitely over the other. I mean, I wrote 10 standalones, so that's all I knew for a long time. And I used to tell that to crime writer friends who wrote long series, and they would throw their hands up in horror, because you're having to because every time you do a new book, you're having to create the world from scratch. You're having to create absolutely everything, all the characters, the world building, all that kind of stuff has to start again. Whereas, one of the obvious advantages of these returning characters is that you've got a lot of that stuff in place. I've got the central premise, for these three women, and I've got the locations because, well, the basic location, is their house and the business where they do the work. So all of that was great. I really enjoyed that. And the other thing about it is with different points of view. So I'm splitting between the three characters. Now I never used to think that was a good idea because I always thought it detracted a little bit from the emotional impact of just staying in one person's point of view and just sort of hammering through the story like that. But of course the flip side of that is that you can do really smart things about suspending the action and creating tension by getting up to a cliffhanger and then moving to someone else's point of view doing something else, and so it's that delayed gratification thing. So from a technical point of view, I mean, it's just a really interesting difference, and I've enjoyed that. I have to say that thinking about it now, I'm kind of working on the third one of a series. It seems quite weird to me now to go back to writing standalones, but I don't know what I'm going to think in 6 months' time. So who knows?
So I've got a question here from a lady named Judith Williams, who must be watching this live on either YouTube or Facebook. And she's saying, 3 generations of women, which generation is easiest to write? And I'm assuming she's meaning like the Skelf lady.
Yeah. That's a really good question. I think the one that is easiest to write for me is Jenny, who's 45 in these books, because it's the closest to my age. I'm 50 now, so she's Generation X and kind of grew up in Scotland. So there's a lot of stuff in common with her mindset and the way she sees the world. She's quite cynical, which I have been accused of in the past. So I found, I think she's probably the character who is the hardest to like out of the three of them. That's certainly some of the feedback I've been getting from readers. But I kind of like that about her. I like that because she's hard to like. Dorothy's been really interesting. I think she's the favourite of most of the readers actually, because it shouldn't be that hard. I mean, she's 70 years old, but still very fit and healthy. And she plays drums and teaches like kids to play drums, and is solving mysteries and carrying out funerals and concerned about her family, obviously. But she's got her own life to lead as well. And she's kind of grieving, but it's that stage where she's, she doesn't have her whole life ahead of her. So it's really interesting. I found that interesting, but I quite enjoyed that challenge of writing a 70-year-old and a 20-year-old. Just because it's kind of, that whole idea of write what you know, that can only take you so far, and I could write Jenny relatively easily, I think, because it's nearest to my own experience. But I enjoyed the stretch of trying to do the other ones.
Definitely. It was just, it appeared there, and I thought, well, we were talking about it. It was just easy
Yeah.
to title. So the questions here I've got. So, how did you actually get started writing? Because in your intro, brief intro, well, obviously you have a list as long as your arm of all the things that you've done. So, how did you actually get started writing as like novel writing?
Novel writing. Well, I mean, I was writing fiction for a long time. As a kid, I was writing it. I mean, I did physics at university, like you mentioned, so I was kind of into science and maths, physics. But I was still writing stories at school, and at university, I was kind of just writing stuff and sticking it in a drawer, and not, it's like short stories. And there were sort of poor versions of like Ian Banks and Irvine Welsh, kind of gritty Scottish, whatever. Thankfully, none of them exist anymore. But it was only when you mentioned that I worked for a few years as an engineer, and then I quit that and I started becoming a music journalist first, an arts journalist. And it was only then, because I was writing I was like much busier than I ever had been before, but I was writing for a living. I was basically freelancing on anything across arts, lifestyle, any kind of journalism whatsoever. And so I was kind of hustling for work. But I was, my day job was writing 500 words on Bob Dylan or reviewing an album or going to a gig or interviewing an author. So that kind of spurred me on to take my own fiction writing seriously, because I don't think I had actually taken it seriously up until that point, because I was just writing stories and putting them in a drawer. Literally, that's all I was doing. So it was about that time, a couple of years after I was a journalist, that I started to write a first novel, which was The Ossians, which you mentioned before, which came from, because I'm a musician as well, and that came from, I mean, a lot of the inspiration for that was not seeing the world that I knew reflected in the books that I saw coming out of Scotland, because I played, I've been in bands since I was at school, none of who got signed, so it's that massive underground music scene, where virtually no one makes it. Like, for every 1,000 bands there are, you get one Coldplay, and like the other 999 struggle to make it or fall apart. And so I was really interested in that world. So that's where my idea for the first book came from. And I wrote that without having a clue, without knowing anybody in the business or anything. And then I got the Writers and Artists Yearbook and sent it to anyone I thought might be interested. And they all rejected it, which is fair enough, because it was probably terrible in that state. And then it was a couple of them rejected it nicely enough for me to think I wasn't completely wasting my time. So I kind of went on and then wrote a draft of Tombstoning, which was kind of based on where I grew up in Arbroath. And I sent that to those two editors, and they both offered to publish it. So I was incredibly lucky. And then I went back and rewrote The Ossians from scratch, basically, and that was my second published novel. But I didn't have an agent at that time. I think it would be less common now. This was kind of before, well, this definitely was before social media, and it was when you still had to print off your manuscript and send it to people in the post. So it was very old school. And I think it's easier and harder maybe in one sense now. I think it's, I mean, I didn't know any better. And I think the chances of getting picked up without an agent are very small now. But so I kind of found it certainly not easy. I mean, it was my second attempt at a book, and then it's, people think that getting a book published is the end, but it's really the start. Because I was also dropped after 2 books by my publisher, and I wrote a third novel which never got published. It's still in a drawer somewhere, and switched agents at that point, and so all sorts of stuff, and ended up with different publishers, different kinds of books. So it's always a learning process, and it always feels like you're kind of just hanging in there a little bit.
So obviously you touched on the next question. So what the agents, did you feel disheartened by like being dropped by publishers and then dropped by agents and then having to move on, and or did you actually feel like that this was like the kick that you needed to say, right, well, actually, you know what, I can go away and I can show them that they've just made the biggest mistake in their life by dropping me.
It's a bit of both, actually. I mean, I was kind of clueless. I didn't really, still at that point, I didn't know a lot of authors. Again, it's before social media, and so I didn't really know much about the publishing industry. And I've always lived in Edinburgh for the last 30 years. So I, hadn't met a publisher or agent really in London, because it's all very much mostly based in London. There was an element where, I mean, that third novel I wrote, yeah, because I was expecting to get dropped. I was with Penguin my first 2 books. I was expecting to get dropped because my editor had been sacked, and so I didn't really have anyone. I mean, it's hard to sign me. So this happens very often. Publishing is a very fickle business, and so when she was let go, I was like, well, nobody in the London office in the Strand even knows who I am. So there's not much chance of getting another book published with these guys. But I'd kind of spent a long time writing this third novel. Which always felt like it wasn't that great anyway. It was my attempt to write The Crow Road by Ian Banks, but it turns out that Ian Banks had already written The Crow Road and it was pretty fucking excellent. So no one needs another one. So
Yeah.
so my agent at the time was kind of a bit cagey about it, and we didn't really send it out that much. Anyway, the whole thing was a bit disheartening, Lynsey. You're right that at that stage I was kind of feeling pretty down, but I did do the other thing of just think it wasn't quite I'll show them it, but it was like it spurred me on to just sit down and write like the quickest, nastiest, funniest book I could think of, and just to hell with it, just to enjoy the writing again, because I hadn't really enjoyed writing for a while. And I wrote like Smokeheads. It was the first draft of Smokeheads, like, really quickly. Absolutely bombed through it. And I showed it to my agent, and she said, "No, I'm not really sure." And I knew at that point she was wrong for me, because I knew that was better than the last thing that I'd been doing, because I could feel it. And so we parted ways. And actually, a friend of mine who's an author and also an agent, he read it just as a sort of, because he was interested. And he said, "Look, I would love to try and sell this." So he became my agent for quite a few books. So and that got picked up again quite quickly. I don't know. I think one of the things is that I learned from that was not that I was particularly trying, but not to try and chase trends in books or anything like that. It's just to actually write what you really believe in, what you really want to write. And I've always kind of done that. I think my books are they're not the most mainstream books. They're crime novels, but they're not necessarily particularly traditional crime novels. And that's just because that's the kind of thing that I wanted to write, and that's the kind of thing I'm interested in reading. And so I'm proud of them when they get out there, irrespective of whether they sell or don't sell, or how well they're received, up to an extent.
Yeah, because I always felt that I'd read Smokeheads. I read Smokeheads, and I always felt that was the one where everybody knew who you, well, it was kind of starting to know, oh, Doug Johnstone, and you'd hear, and then you would see you being on like the panels for crime ones. Because I have read the ones previous to the Oceans, and I can't remember what the other one was called, the Tombstone. Yeah, I think I've got them on Kindle, and you can definitely see that. Definitely, the one thing I like about your books is the fact that I can give them to my friends who are big crime readers, but I can also give them to people who are not big crime. They might be readers, or they might not read at all, and just give them to them, and they get into them and they go, oh wow, and without even saying the genre, they're like, well, that's kind of cool. And then they say what genre, you're like, well, it's pegged hole in the crime, but it sometimes doesn't. There's not a traditional like detective whodunit kind of crime thing, but it's just like the sort of situations these characters find themselves in, kind of like define. Like a lot of your ones don't peg into crime fiction. I think my favourite one was the one with Sen Orkney, where it was they were on the plane, the characters were on the plane, and the plane crashes, and it seems to always be the sort of after effects of sort of looking into Hit and Run was another one. Obviously the characters. It is spoilers if nobody's like read the books, but Hit and Run, when they've actually like had they've caused an accident, and it comes out to be a gangster. So they've obviously, it's like always the after effects. The Jump was good as well. That one was the young lady that committed suicide, and his mum, and she gets embroiled in like things. So I always love that kind of thing, because it's kind of like you never really see that in all books. It's always like a murder or somebody comes along to solve it, a PI, a detective, whatever, maybe it's a journalist. But then to see like the after effects for people of crime, or the characters being involved in something, and then seeing how they cope with it, or what ends up happening afterwards.
Well, it's thank you very much. First of all, that was very kind of you. But like books like Hit and Run and Crash Land and The Jump, they're very much. I love a lot of like American sort of classic noir, which I see noir as being not about solving the crime, but about the criminals or the effects of the crime, or like you say, the ripples that go out from the opening event of what happens. And that's what all those books were really trying to do. I was really interested in, well, what would you do? And they're all, hopefully, if I do my job right, they're all in a sort of morally grey area. So, I think that people like to think that they're the good guys. Everyone likes to think that they would do the right thing if push came to shove, if they were pushed into a corner. But I'm not entirely convinced that we would, given human nature. And so I like to sort of poke away at that and sort of see how characters would behave given a bunch of different, morally questionable options after a plane crash or an attempted suicide or things like that. So that's a lot of what drove those books. And there is some of that still going on in the Skelf books, and because of the closeness to death with the funeral directors, there is stuff that is just not crime at all. Some of it in those books as well. So it's a really interesting mix for me. But again, it's a different kind of generator. But as a writer, you always want to be trying to explore new avenues. So that's always what I've tried to do.
Mm-hmm. So you obviously talked about some authors, named some names, but is there any particular ones, past or present, that have like inspired or influenced your style of writing?
Well, there's always loads, Lynsey. When I first started off, I already mentioned like my first stories were sort of like poor efforts at Ian Banks and Irvine Welsh, and like they were huge influences on me. Not necessarily stylistic. Well, Ian Banks maybe stylistically for his his non-science fiction stuff, but just they were really important because the idea that people like me or you or any other normal person has a life worth writing about in fiction. Because I didn't have a particularly great relationship with English at school or with my English teacher, and I don't think I read anything that was written by an author who was still alive. It was all Oxbridge dead people, and I thought that's what literature was. And so it was really fascinating to me to read something like The Wasp Factory. So that had a huge impact on me. In terms of style, these days, I like a lot of American crime fiction that is around the edges of crime as well. So these days, some of my favorite writers are people like James Sallis, who I think is a brilliant crime writer, writes usually very short books, but they're so deep and full of insight. And Laura Lippman and Megan Abbott and Sarah Gran are all another bunch of American writers who I love everything they do, because again, they're kind of making sure that they're bringing something new. It's not something I've ever read before. So stuff like that I find really fascinating. And another of my absolute favorite writers in the UK is Helen Fitzgerald, who's my buddy at Arenda Books, and she writes brilliant, crazy, funny, offensive, hilarious, weird crime novels. I guess you would call them crime novels. I don't even know what they are. But they're absolutely fantastic. I love her. I love her writing totally.
Yeah, hers is another one you can kind of be pigeonholed. I think Michael Malone's another one that is a crime writer, isn't a crime writer kind of thing. I think there's a lot of these. You just mentioned Laura Lippman, and I'm going, yep, because that was the event that I saw at the festival. The first one I saw was you and Laura Lippman, and I think it was an introduction, which was absolutely great. that's when you get introduced to these authors that you never would have. I mean, I'd read your books, but her books was one of the ones you would never have thought of, but absolutely loved it.
Yeah.
So obviously, majority of your books are set in Edinburgh because obviously you live in Portobello, and then you've obviously gone over to like Orkney for Cashland, which when you said it, I was like, that's the title. And then obviously Smokeheads was Jura, wasn't it? Or was it? It was one of the ones with the whiskey distilleries, yeah. So why did you decide, to set your books in these particular places? I'm assuming Edinburgh because Edinburgh at the back of your hand, but is there any particular reason, or is it just kind of?
Well, for a long time, for the first few books, I didn't really set them in Edinburgh. I was kind of looking back. I think I was a bit wary of doing that because so the first one's set in Arbroath, and the Ossians is kind of all around Scotland, and then Smokeheads is in Ireland, like you said. But it wasn't until my fourth novel that I decided to use Edinburgh as a backdrop, and that was partly because I felt like Edinburgh's such a well-known city in terms of literature. So many people have written about Edinburgh that for a while I thought, well, I thought, well, what can I add to that? But that was stupid because everyone's idea of a city is completely different. So my Edinburgh's completely different from Muriel Sparks or Ian Rankin's or Sandy McCall Smith's or whoever it is, Irvin Welsh's. So I started to use Edinburgh then, but I was very keen, and this was kind of partly not even conscious, but I was keen not to write about sort of the bits of Edinburgh that people knew. And also for those standalone books, they're very often in a very small geographic area, like hardly any action goes anywhere else. And that kind of adds to the kind of sense of claustrophobia and tension for the reader. So Hit and Run is almost exclusively in the south side of Edinburgh. Gone Again's almost all in Portobello. Fault Lines again is almost all in Portobello. Breakers is kind of partly in Niddrie and Craigmillar and partly in sort of Morningside and the kind of really rich affluent areas again. But that's I don't think any of my books have even been to Princes Street, or very rarely. So I kind of always wanted to. I mean, and it is part of that I know the places so well. I mean, it's a different challenge to write about somewhere that you don't live. I mean, I really enjoyed writing about Islay or Orkney, and I would definitely go. I would definitely go to anywhere that I write about. I've done that before, several research trips to go to places. But part of like the Edinburgh thing is, well, there's so much to a city that you can really talk about, and that's actually one of the things that I've really enjoyed doing with the Skelf books, is that it's kind of like, I mean, Ian Rankin has this thing about where he says, well, if you want to write about the whole of a city, then your police officers are really useful because they see all sides of a city, and journalists are probably the same, because they can see the very rich and the very poor. But actually, funeral directors are probably the same as well, because everyone dies. So you've got this opportunity to really explore different elements of a city. So you can be in the sort of Millionaires Row mansions one minute, and going around the homeless shelters the next minute, as actually happens in the Big Chill. So I really wanted to. I'm not trying to make any massive political point, but I really found that juxtaposition. And in any small city, I think these things live very close to each other, and I've always been very interested in that. That's kind of partly what Breakers was about, actually, because it is only a 10-minute drive from Niddrie to Morningside, from millionaire to extreme poverty. So I find that stuff really interesting.
Yeah. So what kind of research, bar like going and visiting the places, do you have to do for your books?
Well, yeah, I do go to the places, and I don't walk about with like a notebook, studiously taking notes. But it's partly just like soaking up the atmosphere of a place, or a street, or a neighbourhood, or in the cases of Orkney, the whole islands if I can. But I do tend to take loads of pictures, and before I was particularly tech savvy, I used to have lots of pictures up on the wall by my desk. I used to print them off and basically and put them all up to try and create the atmosphere of the place. These days, I just have a folder full of pictures, and I kind of have it I have it open on the computer, and I can kind of look through the kinds of houses, the kind of streets, the kind of shops that are there, and all that stuff. So I go around that kind of place. So specifically in terms of location, yeah, I would walk around places as well. It's much more interesting than driving. You tend to miss a whole lot. Just going slower through a place tends to make you more observant and more aware of what's happening around you. And in terms of the other research, I do as much as I can get away with. Ian Banks always said that the reason he wrote fiction was so that he didn't have to research anything. I wouldn't quite go that far, but it's but I do. In this one, I did the research. I worked. You mentioned at the start, I was writer in residence at funeral directors a few years ago for 6 months, and that was fascinating. And it obviously fed into the idea about the Skelfs. Although at the time, that was not the intention at all. It was I was working there really as a non-fiction writer, interviewing members of staff and job shadowing them. So it was only after a couple of years that the idea for the books came to me about that. But that was incredible research.
Yeah, because just as you were saying, you also have been like the scientist. You had a book before Breakers, and is it the island or so? It's about an island that, isn't it?
Yeah, Fault Lines. Yeah.
Fault Lines. That's it. See, I can remember the stories of these books, but it's just not the titles. That it was like obviously the island had just like appeared because of there was some reason that it had appeared, but it was very scientific. And its basis, and now you can start to piece together, right, okay, yeah, I see where he's coming from with this book, because obviously that was his job then. And you obviously, when you had like Hit and Run, you had one with the journal, you can kind of now see, you're like, right, I see now why Doug wrote like that kind of book, because it's obviously fitting into like research, because the main premise of being a writer is obviously, write what you know. Is that not what they say? Write what you know, or write who you know about, sort of thing.
Yeah, and it's worth. You're right. I would say more important than write what you know is to write what you're obsessed about. Like write what you're fascinated in. So, for a long time I was like kind of weirdly obsessed with car crashes, which is why there was lots of car crashes in the books. And then for a while I was really quite obsessed with suicide, which is how the Jump came about, and some elements of the Deadbeat as well. And with the Skelf books, it has been, I've got, without being, I don't think it necessarily is morbid, but I've had a kind of healthy obsession with death and the death industry for a long time. But also there's stuff going on, like the experience that I've just used for the first time, like Dorothy's drumming, for example. Like I drum, and I hadn't ever used that in a book. And Hannah's studying physics at Edinburgh University. And so there's quite a lot of physics, sort of kind of trying to weave that through the plots of these last two books as well. So it's kind of just whatever your passions are. I think it's important to write about that, because if you're not passionate and obsessed about the book while you're writing it, then it's going to be harder for a reader to get passionate about it when they're reading it, I think.
Yeah. So I have a weird thing. I really like air crash investigation on TV. Everything's like mental, and they're like, what? But I'm like, I actually it's not a case of the death, it's actually the one wee small, like in Crash Land, one wee small wrong move, and all the sort of like after effects, and then them piecing it back together to decide, was it pilot error, was it mechanical fault. I just find it really interesting. Everything's like morbid and weird, but hey ho, that's me.
Nothing wrong with morbid and weird. Nothing wrong with being morbid and weird.
Another obviously passion. If anybody knows me knows that I love music as well as books, and I absolutely love the fact that you started the fun loving crime writers, because it was just when people will come up to me and say, "Oh, have you seen them? The band that are crime writers?" And I'm like, "Yeah, pretty much. They're really, really good." And I was like, because they'll say like Glastonbury, and they're like, "Oh, they were at Glastonbury." And I'm like, yeah, I know who you're talking about. And they're like, oh, right, okay. Because they'll say their name, first of all, people's like criminals. And I'm like, you talking to the crime writers? And they're like, yeah, it's like the chili peppers, tobacco. But they, and I'll go, yeah. And they'll go, oh, so, are they any good? And I'm like, yeah, they're really, really good. But people are like, how did you get started with that? Because it's kind of, obviously I know that you've always been a musician, but it's quite a leap to get like people. I mean, the football one at Bloody Scotland, that's just the last. That's a Scotland versus England thing, it's that of laugh at the actually getting the load of you together to be like musicians. That must be like quite an interesting story. I think it would be, just you go from crime writers by day to musicians by night.
Honestly, it's been one of the best things I've ever done. Honestly, it's been so good. I mean, it came about sort of 3 years ago now, maybe more. I can't remember. But we were at. I mean, there was seeds of it all like for years, because at Bloody Scotland, the event of the Curly Coup, the sort of Saturday night thing, various people had got up and done a turn. Like I'd played a song with Val before. Stuart had been up and played. Stuart and Neville had been up and played guitar and things, and Mark had sung and stuff. So we knew there was some sort of talent. We knew there was stuff out there. And then we were at BoucherCon in New Orleans, which is the American crime writing convention. And they had an open mic thing, and me and Stuart and Mark Billingham were there. And literally we just went, what songs do we all know? Let's go up and play a couple of songs. And, we had a few beers and we didn't really think about it. And so we played a couple of songs and they went down really well. And I remember vividly, we were standing at the bar later and I said, we could do this when we go back home. We could just form a band. And we did. It kind of grew. We needed, at that point, we needed a bassist, and we knew that Luca was musical, could play the guitar, and so he was in. And we knew Val, and she was singing, and also Chris. We kind of originally only planned to have Chris come in as a guest vocalist for a song, but he was so good, and he learned the guitar, and he just immediately fitted into the band. And I remember the first rehearsal, and it was looking around after about an hour thinking, this is actually, it could have been awful. It could have been like, no one can play and we don't know what we're doing. But we play, if anyone doesn't know watching, we play songs about crime and murder. So, of which there are hundreds, it turns out. So we kind of were playing this first rehearsal, and I was like looking around. I said to Luca, this is actually pretty good. You're sounding okay. This might work. So, and it has just grown and grown. Like we played that first gig at the Edinburgh Book Festival, whenever it was, 3 years ago, which went down amazingly well. And then it kind of grew from there. We've done book festivals, and then started to play like our own shows and like music venues, and then got invited to festivals like Glastonbury last year. And then unfortunately we had a whole bunch of shows, including the Queen's Hall here in Edinburgh, lined up for this year, which we had to cancel because of the whole lockdown thing. But we're looking forward to, and it's honestly, it's been, it's like we're a proper little family now. It's like a little tight knit group. We really get on so well together, and we love spending time and hanging out. As much as the gigs are brilliant, it's also the bit of the time before and the time after where we're just hanging out and gossiping and drinking and eating and just talking nonsense. And it's such an absolute pleasure being in that band. It's so good.
So, if you could write any other genre of novel other than crime, have you got a particular genre that you would go for? Would it be fiction or non-fiction or?
Yeah, no, I think I would like to write a science fiction book. So I think I didn't really use any of my science background much for a long time with the books, and in the last few books I've been using it more, and it's kind of getting more and more. And so I think a proper sci-fi book would be next on the cards at some point. I'm kind of got some ideas for what to do, but we'll wait and see. But that if I was to pick a genre, that would definitely be it.
Okay, so with the crime writers, if you could collaborate with any crime writer, alive or dead, is there any one that you would go for, or would you not? I know some authors say that they couldn't collaborate because they like to work by themselves, but others, don't mind it as such, or that was just a hypothetical. You could, anybody alive or dead, you could pick them, and you could just like write a book with them.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm not sure. I do very much work alone. I like the sort of, I kind of got into a little routine for how to put words on the page myself. So I'm not sure that I would be great at collaborating, but if I was, I would love to have a go at writing something with Helen Fitzgerald. That'd be great. because we get on.
Really?
So, and she would bring her writing would bring some manic, some pleasant manic energy to the project. So I think that would be good.
Do you have a favourite characters in any of your novels? Any characters that you, bar the Skelf ladies, that you could look from your previous novels in the past that you might think, actually, I'd like to go back and maybe write another novel featuring this person, you know, just the next wee bit in their story, or maybe have them have another adventure or something like that.
Yeah, I think there was still a lot. I think I could have written more about Tyler, who's the 17-year-old boy in Breakers. He got under my skin quite a lot, actually, and I really liked that. I really liked his way of looking at the world. It wasn't simple. It was kind of it was complicated by his circumstances, but and he went through so much. So I wouldn't necessarily want to write another book about him, because that would be putting him through a whole bunch more. But I would like to. I could definitely develop that, I think, and see. So that might be one that I'd quite like to return to. Yeah, Tyler from Breakers would be good fun.
So Judith asked another question. Go, Judith. Yeah. She's saying, do you listen to music while you're writing? What type, and does it change with each book? I take it you know who this person is. Is this a person that comes to your...
I don't think so. I don't think I know. Maybe we've met. I don't know. Sorry, Judith, if we met. Okay. Yeah, music. I do
like something that I know a lot of my friends, like, they're not like family friends and all that, are being like try to support and watch, and it's not somebody that I recognise from, like, you know, like from that I recognise personally. So I was just wondering if somebody always comes to your, like, that you seem to know or something like that. That obviously, you know, you've shared it. Only met at BS. Only met at bloody Scotland, I assume that means.
Okay. All right, cool. Yeah, well, so music. Yes, I do listen to music now. And so the last couple of it has changed. When I first started, I didn't listen to music at all when I was writing, but I now listen to stuff. But it has to be quite ambient and sort of neoclassical, potentially, or kind of laid back, sort of chill out dance music. So no vocals usually. Johan Johansson is a kind of a neoclassical author, sadly no longer with us, and there's a lot of soundtracks for movies. And the last two books I have just listened to him almost exclusively while I've been writing. And Max Richter is another one. I love his music as well. And more dancey stuff, like bands like Boards of Canada, Fortet I'll put on, and the sort of more obscure LCD sound systems. They've got a whole bunch of like remixes, like dance stuff, but it's kind of chilled out dance music, and they go on forever, and it just puts you in a kind of zone. Anything, I mean, I don't want anything that's a verse chorus with melodies in it, because I find that too distracting, and I kind of get distracted by that stuff in a song. So anything just kind of, and the thing I like about Johan Johansson is that the music's slightly edgy. It's kind of weird and sort of dark. So that's often quite good at creating a mood for the kind of books that I'm writing, because they're usually quite edgy and dark as well. So so that kind of fits quite well.
So do you have any words of wisdom or advice that you can share with future generation of novelists?
Oh, wisdom. Yeah. Oh shit, no.
Or just like say, no, just don't do it at all.
Yeah, no. You know, it's any advice always seems really banal. You know, keep writing. You know, it's so boring, but it's like, you know, just keep at it, plugging away. It's like a war of attrition. Both the writing and the getting published are like hard things to do. Okay, the easiest thing in the world is to not write. Okay, it's so easy to go and do something else, like, you know, to walk the dog or do the dishes or stay in bed or watch a box set or whatever. And it can be quite hard to write. So, but actually, you know, so much of it is just getting your bum on the seat and getting words on the page. You know, just getting on with it. I think Helen said in the event earlier on tonight about pretty much the same thing about, you know, it's so much about being dedicated and kind of organized and just getting on with the actual writing. and just keep plugging away. And the thing I mentioned earlier as well is really important. It's like, write what you're passionate about. Write the story that you want to write about, that is unique to you. I think a lot of people get hung up on thinking about the genre or thinking about the what the reader's going to like and all that stuff before you get anywhere near that. And I think that can be the death of creativity a little bit. You can sort of get yourself kind of in a bit of a block about that stuff. But if you're writing about a story that you're passionate and obsessed about, then then that's its own end, really, and that usually produces something that's more likely to be worth reading and more likely to be getting the attention of editors, agents, readers, all that stuff.
So if you can you share any exciting news that you have lined up, or give us a sneak peek into any future novels you have planned? You've talked about there's obviously going to be a third in the trilogy of the Scales ladies. Is there any other books that you've got lined, or even like in the kind of future? I know with lockdown, a lot of authors have said usually they finish one book, they take the 6 months or whatever it is to recuperate, and then they start the next one. But obviously with lockdown, what else? They can't go on holiday, they can't do, so they just start planning the next one. Have you been in that mindset, or have you just kind of like decided book and then I'm just gonna?
No, I've been getting on with it. Like I don't know if you know, Lynsey, but I had a stroke in the start of March. So that was about 2 weeks before lockdown started. So, but my recovery was really good and really quick, actually. And I found after about a month, so it was about a month after I had my stroke, I started writing the third book in the Skelfs series, which I found like a real comfort, actually. I really, because that was just right at the height of lockdown when everyone was going crazy and we didn't really know what was happening. But I found this sort of escape and the regular methodical work really helped me, actually, psychologically, to sort of cope with the whole lockdown thing and recovering from my stroke at the same time and all that stuff. So the third book's really going to be my stroke book, I suppose. It kind of got me through that stuff, and it's like the first two Skelfs books, but like turned up to 11. There's so much more going on. I'm slightly worried there's too much going on, but we'll see. I'm still editing it. I'm still going through redrafting it, so I don't know how it's going to end up. But there's loads of. I think it's more funny than the first two, maybe funnier than the second one. I think there's more comedy. I don't know. We'll see. And then further down the line, I said I'm going to take a break. I do want to write more about Skelfs, but I'm going to take a break, and I think I am going to write a science fiction novel next. We'll see, but I'm certainly planning it at the moment. And I think I just wanted to try again. It's like that thing at the start of the Skelfs trilogy when I really wanted to test myself as a writer and try and write something completely different. And so that's what I'm going to try and do with this science fiction project. Touch wood, it won't be terrible. Fingers crossed.
I don't think so. I think some authors, if they know their subject, they can like make you think, not make you think, but they can not blag it either. But if you know your subject and you're passionate about it, then it will come across in the book. And the thing is, a lot of authors now, like they come up with pen names, but just because in case the publishers decide that they don't, how the fans will say Doug Johnstone crime books are going to take till I'm writing a sci-fi novel, and you've always got that. There's always the one where they want you to write as in back in your own name because they know that name will sell books. I think a few authors have had that where they've gone under a pen name because they just want to distinguish it and go into another sort of like genre. I think I know that obviously Robert Galbraith, J.K. Rowling, but I know in like crime, Quentin Jardine. Now he wrote a book under the name Matthew Reed, or it was something like that, or Matthew's Journey, where he completely changed his name for the first, but then the public, because it wasn't selling, they then changed it back to his own name, sort of thing, so they could sell the book. And I'm like, I thought it was quite good anyway, because it was historical crime fiction. It was like, you're better just sticking with your own name, because your fans are going to enjoy it anyway, because most authors dip in and out of what they like anyway. So, you find somebody will find something to go, oh, I didn't know about that, or that's quite interesting.
I think that publishers underestimate readers all the time. I think publishers quite often want writers. Some publishers do, not mine. Some publishers, I think, want writers to keep writing very similar books, because they are worried that if you write something very different, then the readers and their fans or whatever, the readers will not take to it. But readers readers like to read all sorts of things. That's the way they love books. So I mean, they just want a good quality story, whatever kind of form it's going to take. So I've never really held on to that belief. I've always thought that readers are smarter than publishers like to take them for, I think.
Oh yeah, I mean, I have a whole range of books. Also, a majority is crime, and I'd never part with them because they've all been signed. But then I've got a few like childhood books, and then I've got like the Margaret Atwood, the J.R. Martin, the Game of Thrones, just to look cool kind of thing, and a lot of music biographies. But yeah, I mean, people do give you less credit than, because I mean, most people, I'll go into a bookshop and they'll go, all right, you're going to the crime section. I'm going, no, I would have probably been, but just because I like crime books, I do a crime blog, doesn't mean to say I'm always going to be reading crime books. There's that kind of thing, but I think everybody likes to pigeonhole you into sort of like what kind of books you kind of read. I mean, back when I was a child, I liked Marion Keyes and all sort of chick lit things, the Jenny Colligans. And then when I was a child, if you see my Facebook posts, I mean, I was at the Babysitters Club in Sweet Valley High and all the teeny thingies, and people that would remember me from childhood would be like, how did you get into crime fiction? And it's because at school, they always did Scottish fiction, and then they talk about the modern ones, and you're like, oh well, sort of like you've got Ian Rankin and that, and you just kind of go into that, and you're like, yeah, actually, I kind of like that sort of nitty gritty, telling it as it is, sort of taking Edinburgh and showing the darker underbelly of it, because everybody knows the touristy, happy Edinburgh, but to see as you say, the darker side of Edinburgh that can exist. I mean, I live in a small little village in Fife, and it's absolutely lovely, but there's every place there's a wee darker underside to it, that you don't know your neighbours, and like Highlands Islands crimes, I mean, like Shetland or that, the murderer could live next door to you. Well, actually, yeah, you really don't know who you're living next door to, and it's just that kind of community thing, community, knitted community, and you just don't know who could be living next door to you. It's I love crime fiction, to be honest. It's a good genre to get into. They're lovely authors. Everybody makes you feel so welcome, from like the big names to the up and coming people. Everybody has been just great. Everybody wants to go on the blogs because you get a wee bit of publicity, and it's not just publicity. They love it that you want to support them, and they want to support you in this. I'm definitely promoting the crime books here because they're absolutely great, and the authors as well.
This whole festival is brilliant. Well done for putting everything together.
Thank you very much. That's the end of the Friday. So tomorrow is another day, and that will see us with, in the morning, it's hashtag talking animals, teens and children detectives with Lynn Anderson and Wendy H. Jones. Then Wendy is appearing, so that's 11:30 a.m. if you're up in time. 1 o'clock is Dundee and Angus Crime with the Dangerous Dames, which is Wendy, Chris Longmuir and Jackie McLean. Then we've got 3 o'clock, we've got Fife, talking about the Kingdom of Fife, chaired by me. And that's Tana Collins and Marion Todd, and they both left me messages there, so I'm just giving them a wee shout out. Then at 6 o'clock, we've got Glasgow Crime, chaired by Carol Ramsey with Michael Malone, Mara McKenzie, Michael McKenzie and Owen Mullen. And then at 8 o'clock, it's New and Emerging Talent, and that's Sharon, our bloggers, chapter in my life, Sharon Bearden, Noelle Holton, I think that's how you pronounce her surname. She'll probably kill me for that. Then we've got Andrew James Gregg, and we've got Gordon Kerr as well coming up. So enjoy. And then Sunday is another day as well, with packed full. And thank you so much for supporting me doing this. Good night, everybody.
Thanks very much, Lynsey. Thanks everyone for watching.